firstly, when it comes to reclaiming the Lord's sovereignty over the church, it seems necessary to state the obvious. Civil magistrates do not have the authority to tell the servants of the Most High God when or how, or especially if, they are to engage in corporate worship. The Church of the Lord Jesus Christ is not a government-created institution that is to be sanctioned by the state. Rather, it is a God-ordained organization which reports directly to the king himself. In other words, both church and state are institutions that God has created to be ministers within certain spheres of sovereignty, and neither is to encroach upon the other. Although I will say that the church is to be the conscience of the state and to hold it accountable for its transgressions, as well as to intercede for the state with King Jesus, as Paul makes plain in 1 Timothy 2. Now notice that this sphere sovereignty approach, which is often attributed to Abraham Kuyper, protects us against either the tyranny of the state, the devastating results of which were made manifest in the 20th century, or the tyranny of the individual, which we see taking place in society today. Kuyper's vision of the biblical structuring of society is to have various institutions, each with their own internal hierarchies, and each with their own responsibilities. Never does one dominate the other. They are separate kingdoms, you could even think of it that way, which are designed and mandated to work together to accomplish the goals of their king. So if the leaders of your congregation tell you that they must shut down corporate worship, and that you must be vaccinated in order to participate because the government says so, and we must obey because of Romans 13, or as one prominent voice in evangelicalism lately said, listen, if the government told me to wear a hat with pinwheels on it, I'd wear the hat every day. If your pastors are telling you that we have to do this because the government says so, then they have committed the sin of Adam by abdicating their authority, their responsibility to the government. And that is a very dangerous position for them to be in, as history tells us. The regional Protestant churches during the time of the Nazis, the regional Protestant churches, many of them were formed into the national church. And the leadership was centralized under Ludwig Müller, the Nazi. Right? He was appointed as Reich Bishop. These churches abdicated their authority and their responsibility. Right? They no longer thought for themselves, they were no longer independent, and they became an organ of the state. And if such a church cannot be reformed, it must be abandoned, especially given the times we are living in. Up until recent times, you could have had this view, and many churches did, and it didn't make that much difference. But now, it makes a difference, a huge difference. A second area where we must reclaim the Lord's sovereignty is in the family. And there are so many things to say here, but let me focus on just one. And I'm speaking to the fathers who are the heads of the family. Fathers, it is your responsibility ultimately to train up your children. Not the Department of Education, not the Texas Education Agency, not the local school board, not the teachers in the classroom, not your wife. It's your responsibility. God is going to hold you responsible for the rearing of your children. Just as God held Adam responsible for the disobedience of Eve. She disobeys, right? And God comes and he doesn't go to Eve, he goes to Adam and he says, what's happened to this institution that I have created? How has it become corrupted? Adam, explain this to me. If you think you can abdicate your responsibility to your wife, it didn't work for Adam. It won't work for you. Men, God has given you the authority over your offspring when it comes to their educational formation. He has not given that to the government. And let's be clear. What education does is not provide your child a bunch of neutral facts. Education is a discipling process in which the student is shaped into the ideal image found within the minds of those who instruct them. Schools are culture-forming institutions. The question to be asked at the end of one's education is not what have you learned, but who have you become? And the image that secular schools wish to conform our children to is not the imago Dei. It is not the image of God. And the devastating truth is that the vast majority of Christian men have simply abdicated that responsibility. We've all seen these videos where parents are protesting at the school board meetings and these school officials are looking down their noses in disgust at these parents. And these videos are pathetic on many levels. Because the only authority these government hacks have over your child is that which you have given them. And giving them this authority has proven to be a colossal blunder. Because not only has it gone to their head, obviously, but they have done an abominable job of it. And you have failed to guard your children against it. You have allowed the stone wall to fall into disrepair, and vandals are coming in and destroying the garden of your child's soul. I can't state it clearly enough and more directly. It's time to reassert your authority and pull your children out of government schools. The time for reform has long since passed. How long will you wait? How much longer is the question. How much worse does it have to get before you finally say, well, maybe this isn't a good idea? A third area where we must reclaim the Lord's sovereignty is in the government. And thus the question is thrust upon us. Should we abandon this institution which has become so corrupted? Or should we try to reform it? And at this point, I don't know. But I'm leaning towards abandoning it, as difficult as that might be. But one thing that gives me pause is the fear that we will, in an effort to get as great of a consensus as possible, form a new union over which Christ is not sovereign. Or at least one in which we do not acknowledge that sovereignty. Such a project would be doomed from the start. And it would not be worth the blood spilled in order to purchase it. Now, maybe all of this responsibility seems overwhelming to you. Again, I'm mostly speaking to the men now. And it can trickle down. But men here, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that amount of responsibility seems overwhelming. Right? You think, I just can't do it. It's just too much. And what I have to say to you is quit being a sluggard. Quit being lazy. Quit being a fool. You've been lazy your whole life, and now you've grown soft and weak. And it's time to strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, as it says in Hebrews 12:2. It's time to grow up and take responsibility for yourself and those in your charge. You can no longer abdicate your responsibilities to the God of this world, committing afresh the sin of Adam. That comes to an end now, today. Let us instead take up our mantle and fulfill our mandate, weeding old gardens and building new ones, so that God may be glorified in the garden that we build. Let's be men for goodness' sake.